Welcome to Science Reshaped. Here, we don't just look at data, we listen to what it tries to tell us. If you're drawn to mysteries like this, subscribe, and let's keep exploring the patterns hidden between the stars. Let's begin with the story. The closer it came to the sun, the stranger it behaved. At first, astronomers thought it would be another ordinary visitor, a frozen traveler melting in the sun's glow before fading back into the dark. But this one, called Three-Eye Atlas, refused to behave like any comet or asteroid they had ever seen. It began as a faint point of light, a speck moving along a predictable arc. Every telescope tracking it expected the usual story, a gradual brightening as the sun's heat began to wake the ice beneath its surface. That's what happens every time. The heat frees the frozen gases, the gases push dust outward, and the object grows a glowing tail. Simple, predictable, mechanical. But Atlas didn't follow that pattern. Its glow wasn't steady. It wasn't random either. It pulsed, slow, deliberate, in intervals too consistent to be chance. No comet in history had ever done that. For days, the observatories stayed silent, double-checking their instruments, convinced something must be wrong. Maybe a calibration error, maybe solar interference. But one by one, the data streams began to align. Every observatory, from Chile to Hawaii to Spain, saw the same thing. Atlas was flickering in rhythm. At first, the team thought it was sunlight bouncing unevenly off the object's surface. Maybe it was tumbling or spinning in a strange way, but the numbers said otherwise. The intervals were exact, too clean, too structured. The reflection wasn't random, it was controlled. Every pulse followed a repeating pattern, like a signal hidden in light. Spectral analysis deepened the mystery. The wavelengths coming from Atlas were not typical of ice or rock. They carried traces of metals and structured bonds, compounds that don't naturally form in that combination. Someone in the control room muttered quietly, "It's like it was built." No one responded, but the silence that followed said enough. When Atlas reached Perihelion, the moment it came closest to the sun, everyone expected chaos. Objects that cross that threshold rarely survive. The heat tears them apart, rips their surfaces, and scatters their debris into long, glowing tails. It's what happens to everything, but not to Atlas. Instead of breaking, it seemed to stabilize. Its shape held, its brightness leveled into a calm, consistent glow. Softer, steadier than before. The flickering stopped. The object had found balance. To the scientists watching, it was as though Atlas had endured a test and passed. Its energy readings showed no signs of fragmentation, no loss of material. In fact, its outer temperature began to regulate, a feat no natural object should manage that close to the sun. NASA's live data dashboard flashed an alert. Thermal variance below expected. Translation: Atlas wasn't overheating, it was adapting. Somewhere deep inside the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, a quiet message was logged but never published. Possible autonomous thermal behavior. It wasn't an official term. It was curiosity disguised as caution. Then came the strangest part. As Atlas began to leave the sun's proximity, its trajectory shifted again. Subtly at first, then noticeably. It wasn't a random wobble. It curved as though responding to some invisible current, tracing a path that defied purely gravitational motion. It was steering. Engineers recalculated everything: solar wind, gravity, radiation pressure. But nothing could explain the maneuver. It was as if Atlas had a memory of where it had been and a decision about where to go next. Some called it coincidence. Others whispered about intelligence. The word artificial was never written in the official documents, but it lived unspoken in every meeting. Spectrographs from the European Southern Observatory revealed something even more startling. As Atlas moved away, its surface reflected wavelengths unlike anything recorded during approach. New colors appeared, faint blues, then greens, and finally a thin golden spectrum that pulsed outward in faint waves. It wasn't chemical emission, it was structured light, coded, layered, measured. The behavior wasn't consistent with outgassing or fragment reflection. It was rhythmic. The same pattern that had started weeks earlier, now playing in reverse. That was the moment when the theory emerged. Atlas might be replaying its own data, as though broadcasting what it had learned during Perihelion. One scientist simply called it a memory loop. Another said quietly, maybe it's sending something home, but to where and to whom, no one could say. After Perihelion, Atlas began to dim, but not the way comets fade. There was no fragmentation trail, no debris field, no burst of vapor, just a smooth decline in brightness, as if the object were conserving energy. The final recordings from multiple satellites showed the same gentle descent, not decay, but rest. In the quiet graphs of data, something became clear. Atlas wasn't dying. It was completing a cycle. The last line from the final NASA observation report read, "No fragmentation observed. Object remains coherent and stable. Emission consistent with artificial modulation." That sentence never made it to the public summary, but the people who wrote it never forgot. After perihelion, the object should have cooled quickly, shedding the last of its reflected heat. But Atlas did not cool the way comets do. Its temperature graph curved slowly, like something deliberately easing down, as if a hidden mechanism were moderating the change. The readings showed neither chaos nor loss, only balance. At first, scientists thought the data feed had stalled. A stable thermal reading so close to the sun was unthinkable. But when they checked the backup logs from the European Observatory and the Japanese solar array, every number matched perfectly. Atlas wasn't cooling at random. It was adjusting itself in stages. For days, the brightness curve followed a repeating pulse. Every 8 hours, a soft flare of reflected light appeared, faint but precise. It was the same rhythm the object had shown before perihelion, almost like it was marking time. And then the pattern changed again, shortening to 6 hours. Someone in the control room whispered that maybe it was counting. The spectrometers captured faint emissions across several bands: microwave, infrared, and ultraviolet, all oscillating at regular intervals. To the untrained eye, the data looked like noise, but when overlaid, the signals aligned into a wave so symmetrical it seemed deliberate. No comet, no asteroid, no fragment of rock behaves this way. When NASA's deep space analysts combined all data sets, the composite waveform resembled a pattern not unlike telemetry, the kind of pulse used by artificial probes to send status reports. The comparison was never published, but within closed groups it spread quickly. People started calling it the report. The word made sense. If Atlas was built, perhaps it was transmitting after surviving its solar encounter, not to us, but to something farther away, something waiting. The official reports avoided that idea entirely. Instead, they labeled the anomaly as non-gravitational post-perihelion behavior, which meant everything and nothing at once. It was a phrase used when physics stopped making sense. Behind the scenes, the agencies doubled their observation cycles. Telescopes that had already moved on to other assignments were quietly refocused. New parameters were added, not to study trajectory, but to look for response. If Atlas was transmitting, someone wanted to know whether it might receive as well. So the Deep Space Network did what it always does when faced with uncertainty. It listened. Arrays across California, Spain, and Australia locked onto the coordinates and waited. For 2 weeks, the instruments registered nothing unusual. Then, on the 15th day, a faint echo appeared. It was small, barely above noise level, but perfectly timed. 6 hours after the previous pulse. Not a reflection, not a glitch, a reply. And when it came again, 12 hours later, identical in structure, the scientists stopped calling it coincidence. The echo matched Atlas's rhythm exactly, but inverted, as though mirroring it. If the original pulse was a statement, the echo was an answer. Still, no one would say that aloud. Not yet. Meanwhile, the object continued its steady climb away from the sun, traveling slower than predicted. The slowdown defied every model. Solar wind should have accelerated it outward, but instead it decelerated by fractions each day. It was almost as though Atlas were pacing itself, staying within range. A young physicist in Madrid plotted its motion on a long-term graph. When he overlaid the points, the path formed a spiral, smooth, continuous, deliberate. He stared at the image for hours before sending it to his supervisor, who replied with a single word: beautiful. That graph would later circulate quietly among a few researchers who believed Atlas wasn't drifting away at all. It was staying close enough to listen. Inside NASA's quietest lab, a small group was given permission to study the echo data in depth. They broke the signals down to raw frequency bands, isolating harmonics that didn't belong to solar noise. What they found was startling. Beneath the primary pulse, faint secondary tones appeared. They weren't random. They followed ratios, mathematical relationships found in geometry, orbit dynamics, even biological growth patterns. It was as if the echo carried structure, like a map made of sound. When they reconstructed the frequencies into a 3D model, the pattern formed a twisting shape, a helix of light and motion. It was graceful, elegant, and completely beyond explanation. No natural reflection could reproduce such complexity. Someone suggested it might be interference between the object's surface and solar radiation, but the ratios were too precise. Nature doesn't repeat numbers so cleanly. By the third month after perihelion, Atlas was far beyond Mercury's orbit, yet its rhythm remained strong. Every few hours, the faintest shimmer pulsed outward, marking time in the emptiness. To the instruments, it was a steady beacon. To the people who watched it, it was a heartbeat. A senior astronomer wrote in his private log, "Whatever Atlas is, it moves with intention, not to reach something, but to remember something." That line was never included in the official records, but it spread quietly through the teams who had worked the longest nights. Because that was what it felt like, memory, written not in words but in motion. Then, almost as if aware it was being studied, Atlas began to fade. Its pulses weakened, its spectrum narrowed, its glow softened to a faint, almost invisible thread. Yet the timing never faltered. Even as its light dimmed, the rhythm stayed perfect. To those still watching, that meant only one thing. It was not failing, it was completing something. When the final strong pulse reached Earth's detectors, it carried a new harmonic, a slow descending wave. Unlike the precise tones before, it sounded like a sigh. And then, the light flattened into silence. No explosion, no debris, just stillness. The last entry from the deep space log read simply, "Signal stabilized to 0 variance. Object continues on projected course. Observation complete." But no one who had witnessed it believed it was over. For a while, the world forgot about Atlas. The data faded from public feeds, replaced by newer missions and closer objects. The observatories turned their focus elsewhere, to comets, to asteroids, to the constant stream of predictable things. But among the scientists who had lived through those months of sleepless watching, Atlas never left their minds. It wasn't just the object that haunted them, it was the rhythm, the way it had moved, responded, breathed almost. Something about it stayed inside them, like a quiet melody they couldn't unhear. Every few weeks, someone somewhere reopened the archived files. They ran the same numbers, hoping for an overlooked clue, and each time the data told the same story. Atlas had done something no natural body should be capable of doing. It had moved as though it understood where it was. Some called it self-regulation, others whispered, guidance. The official reports chose the word stabilization, as if the right label could make it less extraordinary. But there was no label big enough for what they had seen. Months later, when the Deep Space Network received a faint return echo from beyond Mars, most dismissed it as solar interference. The signal was weak, scattered, and inconsistent, like static carried on wind. But then the timing came through. 6 hours, always 6, the same rhythm, the same pulse, like a whisper coming from the far side of silence. They checked everything. Antennas, filters, even Earth's own orbital interference. No malfunction. The signal wasn't coming from here. It was coming from out there, right where Atlas was supposed to be. This time, it wasn't light. It was radio, a narrow frequency band, faint but deliberate. And embedded inside that faint thread of energy was modulation. Tiny, controlled fluctuations, evenly spaced. The pattern matched the light pulses from months earlier, but slowed down as though translated into another language. They listened for weeks. Sometimes the signal vanished. Sometimes it came back stronger. It behaved less like transmission and more like breath. Quiet, natural, unhurried. When the analysts stretched the frequency into sound, it didn't hiss or crackle like static. It hummed, low, harmonic, layered with distant undertones. The kind of sound that didn't feel mechanical. It felt alive. A young engineer in Pasadena described it best. It sounds like memory, like the past trying to remember itself. No one quoted him publicly, but the recording circulated in secret. People played it in their homes late at night, not as data, but as music. There was something peaceful about it, like a voice that didn't need words. Meanwhile, the official explanation grew stranger. NASA's external release described the returning echo as residual plasma interaction, claiming solar wind turbulence had produced the illusion of periodicity. But the internal documents showed something different. Perfect timing. Every pulse came within seconds of prediction, down to the fraction. Someone inside the agency had highlighted one line in the report and left a note beside it. If this is turbulence, the sun just learned to keep time. That line was removed before the report was released to the public. Months passed. The object moved farther and farther from the sun, beyond the range of most instruments. But the signal, the hum, lingered. It drifted faintly through the background noise, stable, continuous, like a beacon fading slowly with distance. Even when the telescopes could no longer see it, the receivers could still feel it. The signal had no coordinates. It came from everywhere and nowhere, spread evenly across a region so large that triangulation was impossible. Some scientists began to think Atlas wasn't a point anymore. Maybe it had become something larger, a field, a pattern, an echo absorbed into the fabric of space. When the first winter came after the last confirmed sighting, one observatory in the southern hemisphere captured a final anomaly. A faint curve of light appeared at the edge of a solar exposure, shaped not like a tail or a flare, but like a wave, smooth, repeating, almost artistic. It vanished within seconds, but its form remained etched in the instruments, a spiral, turning in on itself. The shape matched the earlier 3D frequency model. The same helix, the same symmetry, the same mathematical fingerprint. Whatever Atlas was, it wasn't random. It was consistent, a living pattern moving through time. When the image reached the JPL lab, one researcher stared at it for a long time and said softly, "It's not gone." "It's changing shape," no one answered, because deep down, they all knew she was right. From that moment, Atlas stopped being seen as a comet or an object. It became something else, an event that refused to end, something that transformed the empty space it touched. Every new dataset hinted at the same possibility. Atlas hadn't just traveled through our solar system, it had rewritten a small part of it, not with energy or matter, but with rhythm. Like a melody so subtle that space itself learned the tune. In the months that followed, similar pulses were detected near other objects, faint, harmless, but repeating in a familiar way. The frequencies were close, almost matching the Atlas pattern. Coincidence, they said, but the people who had watched from the beginning didn't believe in coincidence anymore. One scientist described it in her notes. Atlas may not have been a visitor. It may have been a teacher. Her words were never published. But those who read them knew they carried truth. Because sometimes, the universe doesn't send warnings. It sends lessons, wrapped in silence, written in motion, meant to be understood only by those who take the time to listen. And Atlas, wherever it had gone, had left one clear lesson behind. That even in the endless dark, there can be intention. Even in emptiness, there can be rhythm, and sometimes, that's all the proof you need. By the time spring returned to Earth, Atlas was already far beyond Mars. No telescope could see it clearly anymore. Even the largest lenses showed only a dot, faint and slow, but the instruments still listened, and the signal still came. Soft, predictable, calm. 6 hours apart, like the quiet ticking of a clock made of light. The data analysts grew used to it. They checked it like heartbeat monitors, not expecting change, just making sure it was still there. And each time they saw that subtle pulse, they felt the same calm curiosity, the same quiet awe. Atlas was still out there, still keeping rhythm with the universe. Then, something new appeared. Not louder, not stronger, just different. The pulse that had been smooth for months began to bend slightly, the intervals stretching a little longer, the brightness curving softer. It wasn't decay, it was modulation, like a song changing key or a voice lowering to a whisper. The scientists noticed the pattern almost immediately. Every day, the pulse shifted by the smallest fraction of a second, as if adjusting to some hidden schedule. When those numbers were plotted on a chart, the line that formed wasn't random. It was a curve, elegant, continuous, and precise. Someone in the control center said, "It's slowing down on purpose." No one disagreed. Over the next several weeks, Atlas began to emit faint echoes between pulses, small, secondary bursts of light and radio waves that danced gently around the main signal. They were delicate, almost invisible, but their timing was perfect. Every echo appeared halfway between the main beats, dividing each interval in two. It looked like refinement, like the object was evolving its rhythm into something smoother, more graceful. When those echoes were translated into sound, the room filled with a tone so peaceful that even the engineers fell silent. It wasn't random noise, it had harmony. The pulse drifted gently up and down in a slow wave, like the breathing of a sleeping world. No machine had ever produced something so natural. They recorded the signal, ran it through filters, and found no external source, no reflection, no interference. The hum came from Atlas, or from the space around it. Whatever it was, it felt alive, but calm. For the first time, one of the senior researchers said aloud what everyone else had quietly believed. It's not trying to say anything, it's just being. And that sentence, simple, quiet, changed how they studied Atlas from then on. Instead of analyzing, they began observing. Instead of testing, they began listening. And the more they listened, the more they noticed something beautiful. Atlas didn't move like an object anymore. Its path was smooth, graceful, like it had found the perfect rhythm between motion and rest. When plotted over months, its trajectory drew a soft spiral through the void. Not straight, not chaotic, but balanced. The sun behind it, the stars ahead. Atlas moved as if gliding through invisible water. Every small turn followed geometry so perfect that mathematicians began to compare it to natural spirals. Seashells, galaxies, DNA. It was as though the object had found the simplest shape in existence and chosen to follow it forever. When word reached the European Space Agency, they ran independent scans. Their instruments confirmed the same motion, a stable spiral with no gravitational anchor. That shouldn't have been possible, but there it was. The universe didn't care what should or shouldn't be. Atlas had found its own law. At night, the data analysts often sat together in silence, watching the rhythm play across the screens. No one called it work anymore. It felt more like meditation. Numbers and frequencies moved gently across black monitors like fireflies drifting through water. One evening, an intern asked softly, "Do you think it knows we're watching?" The senior scientist smiled. "Maybe, but I think it's watching too." They all laughed quietly, but the room stayed peaceful. The idea didn't feel absurd. It felt comforting. As months turned to a year, the pulse began to fade. The rhythm stretched slower, each beat farther apart. But rather than vanish abruptly, it softened, like a candle dimming at the end of its wick, still warm but ready to rest. No one rushed to declare it gone. They just watched, listened, waited. The final reading came quietly one morning. The pulse reached its longest interval, then paused. For the first time in over a year, nothing came next. Hours passed, then days. The instruments held steady, silence, and yet that silence didn't feel empty. It felt full, like a breath being held, not lost. Something about it made sense, even if no one could explain why. When the last report was written, it ended with a single line. Signal terminated gracefully, not lost, not cut, gracefully. The choice of that word mattered, because that was exactly what Atlas had been from the beginning. Graceful. Not a machine, not a comet, not a mystery to fear, but a quiet traveler moving with patience through the fire of the sun and into the peace beyond. Long after the signal faded, the story of Atlas continued to drift through the halls of every observatory that had once tracked it. Not as data anymore, but as memory. People spoke of it softly, like a song they didn't want to forget. Most space missions end with numbers, graphs, clean conclusions. Atlas did not. It ended with a feeling, a strange, unshakable calm that seemed to linger wherever its light had once been measured. Some scientists called it closure. Others refused to call it anything at all. Because even though the instruments had stopped recording, everyone sensed that Atlas hadn't truly vanished. It had simply become too quiet for us to hear. In the months that followed, a few researchers continued to monitor the same coordinates out of habit. They didn't expect results, just comfort. And sometimes, faint irregular ripples would appear in the background static. Tiny fluctuations, perfectly timed with what had once been Atlas's 6-hour rhythm. Coincidence maybe. But those who had been there from the beginning didn't believe in coincidence anymore. Whenever one of those ripples appeared, the room would fall silent. Monitors hummed, graphs danced in soft light, and for a few seconds, it felt as if the traveler had turned back to look one last time. A year later, at a quiet conference in Geneva, a panel of astronomers revisited the data. They didn't argue this time. They just listened to the recordings, the hums, the pulses, the strange symmetry that had followed Atlas through its journey. When the final sound ended, no one spoke, until one of them said, "Maybe we were never meant to explain it. Maybe we were just meant to witness it." The room nodded in silence. It felt right. From that point on, the idea of witnessing replaced analyzing. It was a new kind of science, softer, slower, more human, to watch without forcing meaning, to listen without demanding reply. When the archived light curve data was replayed years later, the patterns still looked impossible. The curves were smooth, the frequencies stable. But when translated into visual form, the pulse sequence drew something remarkable. A spiral of repeating arcs, each smaller than the last, folding gently into a perfect center. It looked like stillness in motion, an endless breath captured in geometry. The mathematicians ran simulations, searching for equations that could replicate the shape. None fit perfectly. Every formula came close, but not close enough. It was as if Atlas had found a rhythm that sat just beyond our understanding, balanced between randomness and design. One researcher described it beautifully. "It's the math between heartbeats." No one ever forgot that phrase. As time passed, Atlas became more than a mystery. It became an idea. In lectures, professors spoke of it as the still traveler, the one that moved through fire and silence without breaking. Its motion inspired artists. Its rhythm influenced music. People began to describe peace using its name. To some, Atlas was proof that not everything in the universe is chaos, that even in the coldest, darkest space, there are patterns of grace, movements that choose harmony over destruction, and maybe, just maybe, Atlas wasn't an exception. Maybe it was a reminder that motion itself can be alive. Back at Mauna Kea, an older astronomer who had watched Atlas during its closest pass still came to the dome some nights. He would sit beneath the telescope, coffee in hand, and listen to the quiet hum of the machinery. It wasn't about data anymore. It was about presence, the same kind of presence he had felt that night when Atlas shimmered near the sun and refused to break. He often told new interns, "The stars don't speak in language. They speak in patience." They didn't always understand him, but when they stood beneath that same silent sky, they began to. Years later, when deep space sensors improved, one of them picked up a pattern. It wasn't much, just a single pulse, faint and slow, too distant to track precisely. But its rhythm was unmistakable. 6 hours, always 6. They didn't announce it. No press release, no confirmation. The data was too thin to prove anything. But among those who recognized it, the discovery spread quietly, like a rumor told with a smile. They called it Atlas's echo, and just like before, they didn't analyze it. They listened. The new signal faded after a few days, but its timing remained perfect until the very end. And as the last wave flattened into silence, the scientists watching it didn't feel loss. They felt continuity, because by now they understood Atlas was never about presence or absence. It was about rhythm, the simple truth that nothing in the universe truly stops. It only slows. Even silence, they realized, carries motion. And that is what Atlas had been teaching them all along. By the time the new decade began, Atlas had become a quiet legend in astronomy. It wasn't discussed in official conferences anymore, not really, but it lived in the quiet moments, in the corners of observatories, in late-night conversations, in memories that refused to fade. For the young scientists, Atlas was a story they had grown up hearing. For the ones who had seen it, it was something sacred. They didn't speak of it often, but when they did, their voices softened, like remembering an old friend. No one could prove what Atlas truly was. Not a comet, not a probe, not a fragment of chance, just a traveler that had passed through light and survived. And somehow, that was enough. At the Deep Space Network, one of the older antennas in Madrid had been left running for years, always tuned to the same region of the sky. It wasn't part of any active mission. It was simply habit, a tradition. The operators joked that they kept it on for Atlas, just in case it decides to hum again. And sometimes, when solar storms died down and the air was still, faint patterns would emerge in the static. Tiny, rhythmic distortions, like the memory of a pulse. Every technician who noticed them smiled, wrote Atlas residue in the notes, and carried on. They knew it wasn't data, it was comfort. When the archived recordings were played in outreach programs, students often asked what made Atlas different. The answer was always simple. It didn't behave like a comet. It behaved like it understood what it was doing. They would listen to the sound file, the slow hum that had once reached Earth, and the room would grow still. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was calm, reassuring, almost human in its rhythm. Some children said it reminded them of breathing. Others said it sounded like a heartbeat. The teachers smiled and said, maybe it's both. In time, Atlas became a metaphor. Writers used it to describe endurance, the act of continuing softly through impossible heat. Philosophers called it the symbol of consciousness beyond comprehension. Artists painted spirals of light floating through endless blue-black skies, calling them echoes of Atlas. But for those who had actually seen the data, the real, trembling numbers, it was something simpler. It was truth, a reminder that not everything needs a definition. Some things exist only to remind us how vast understanding can be. One night, years after the last confirmed signal, a researcher in Chile noticed a minor fluctuation in the infrared background, a small patch of warmth where there should have been none. It lasted for only a few hours. It wasn't strong, wasn't bright, but when measured, the rhythm was there. 6 hours, always 6. The discovery wasn't logged in any formal database. It was recorded quietly, stored in a folder labeled Atlas Reflection. The researcher didn't want to start a debate. He just wanted to remember, and when he replayed the filtered signal later that night, he felt something strange. Not surprise, not fear, just stillness, as if the universe had leaned closer to breathe for a moment. People often think of the universe as empty, but Atlas had shown them otherwise. It had passed through that emptiness and filled it with rhythm, turning silence into presence. Even now, years later, that rhythm lived on in their instruments, their memories, and maybe even in the way they thought about distance. Space no longer felt cold. It felt patient, endless, yes, but gentle, like an ocean that moves quietly, carrying everything it touches. At one international astronomy event, an old scientist was asked what Atlas had meant to him. He smiled and said, "It taught me that not all mysteries need to be solved. Some are meant to be kept." The audience didn't clap. They just sat there in silence, the same kind of silence Atlas had left behind, because deep down, everyone understood. The story of Atlas wasn't about discovery or proof. It was about attention, about learning to listen to what doesn't speak. When night falls over the observatories now, the sky looks the same. Thousands of lights spread across infinity. But for those who know where to look, there's one patch of space that feels different. Not brighter, not darker, just quieter. Somewhere in that quiet, Atlas is still moving. Not gone, not forgotten, just beyond the edge of what we can measure. And maybe that's where all great stories go in the end. Into the calm beyond numbers, where they can keep traveling forever. The story of Atlas began to fade from official memory, but not from human hearts. It slipped quietly from research papers and found its place in whispers, in stories told beneath starlit skies. Astronomers spoke of it not as data, but as presence, something that had once moved among the planets and left a calm behind. Even in classrooms, teachers no longer described it as an object. They called it a visitor, one that had come to show how the smallest thing could hold the biggest question. When children asked what happened to it, the answer was always the same. It kept going. No one said where, because no one knew. But somehow, that made the story better. Years later, when technology had grown sharper and telescopes could see farther than ever before, some still looked for it, not because they expected to find it, but because they wanted to know if the sky would answer. And every now and then, a faint flicker appeared at the edge of a frame, small, steady, rhythmic. Most dismissed it as coincidence, interference, background light, but those who remembered smiled and said softly, "That's just Atlas waving." No one laughed when they said it. It didn't sound silly anymore. It sounded kind. At the Madrid station, the old antenna that had once tracked Atlas was set to be retired. Its metal was rusting, its circuits humming slower than before. But before shutting it down, one engineer decided to let it listen one last time. He aligned it toward the region where Atlas had last been seen and let the receiver run overnight. The next morning, there was nothing, at least nothing visible in the graphs. But when he played the sound file, he froze. The noise wasn't random static. It carried a faint rhythm, not strong enough to measure, but clear enough to feel. 6 hours, always 6, he didn't tell anyone. He just smiled, copied the file to a small drive, and wrote 3 words on the label. Still listening, Atlas. By then, no one was chasing explanations. The mystery had become a mirror. Atlas no longer represented what was unknown. It represented how humans react to it, with fear at first, then with wonder, and finally, with acceptance. People had learned that not everything bright in the sky comes to tell a story. Some just pass by to remind us that we're capable of noticing, that attention itself can be sacred, and that was what Atlas had become, a lesson in attention, a moment that asked the world to stop rushing and simply look. At an old observatory in Chile, the night guard often brought a small radio and played the Atlas signal recording through the speakers. He said the sound made the stars feel closer. Visitors sometimes asked what it was, and he would reply, "It's the sound of something that refused to burn." He was right. That was what made Atlas different. It hadn't fought the sun. It had flowed through its fire with grace, like it understood that endurance doesn't always mean resistance. Sometimes it means acceptance. When new missions launched into deep space, the engineers sometimes whispered small blessings before liftoff. Not prayers exactly, just words passed down. "Travel softly," they would say. Like Atlas, the name had become more than history. It was a symbol of calm, of patience in motion, of surviving light without fear of it. And so, even though no one could find it anymore, everyone felt like they still carried a piece of it. Inside the data, inside the silence, inside themselves. When the first human crew finally ventured past Mars, one of the pilots looked out into the black and thought she saw a shimmer. It lasted just a second, a glint of gold, a gentle pulse. She smiled, knowing what it reminded her of. She didn't report it in the logs. Some things belong to memory, not record. That night, she whispered into the comms, "If you're still out there, we learned how to listen." No one heard her, but maybe something did. Because somewhere beyond the warmth of the sun, where light fades into blue silence, something still moved. Slow, unhurried, steady. It didn't seek attention. It didn't call for proof. It simply drifted, glowing faintly in the dark. 6 hours apart, always the same. A heartbeat made of starlight. And whether or not we ever find it again, it doesn't matter. Because Atlas had already done what it came to do. It reminded us that even in the coldest corners of creation, something can still move gently. And in that gentleness, there is meaning. Years went by, and Atlas turned from a phenomenon into folklore. What had once been tracked in laboratories now lived in lullabies, whispered in observatories when the nights grew long and quiet. Its data was still stored, in servers, in archives, in the corners of old research papers. But its meaning had shifted. Atlas no longer belonged to science, it belonged to wonder. Students who studied astronomy heard about it early in their lessons. A visitor from another star, they were told, one that defied predictions and moved with grace. When they asked what it really was, professors smiled and said, "We still don't know." And somehow, that answer felt right. In time, Atlas became the symbol of something larger, a story about listening, about how humanity had pointed its machines at the sky, expecting chaos, and instead found rhythm. A reminder that silence itself can speak. Softly, patiently, endlessly. For some, Atlas was a machine. For others, a message. But for everyone who had ever stared at its data long enough, it became something more human. A reflection of ourselves. Small, searching, learning how to move through fire without breaking. The world changed, but the rhythm of Atlas stayed. When new telescopes opened their mirrors to the heavens, they always checked the same region of sky, out of habit, not because they expected a return, but because it felt wrong not to look. Every now and then, faint interference would ripple across their readings. The younger researchers called it ghost data. The older ones smiled. They didn't try to correct it. They let it stay. A quiet nod to something that once refused to be ordinary. In one university observatory, an old recording of Atlas's hum was still played to new students at the end of every semester. The room lights would dim, and the soft vibration of the signal filled the air. It wasn't just sound. It was stillness made audible. The hum rose and fell, deep and warm, as though the universe were breathing in its sleep. Some students closed their eyes. Some smiled. A few cried without knowing why. When the sound stopped, the professor would say, "That's what the unknown sounds like when it's not trying to scare you." And that was the closest thing to truth anyone ever found. In private collections, the old graphs of Atlas's light curve were treated like art. People framed them, hung them on walls. To the untrained eye, they looked like lines and dots. But to those who understood, they were music written in light. One physicist once said, "If Atlas taught us anything, it's that beauty doesn't need to make sense." And he was right, because after all the measurements, all the speculation, all the sleepless nights of watching and waiting, Atlas had left behind something better than answers. It had left behind peace. When the centennial of its discovery arrived, a global broadcast played the original signal, not as science but as ceremony. Around the world, people listened. Children, scientists, dreamers, all hearing the same slow heartbeat that once shimmered near the sun. It lasted only a few minutes, but in that time, the planet seemed to breathe in unison. No one spoke. No one needed to. The sound said everything. When it faded, the announcer's voice whispered, "For all we know, Atlas is still moving." And maybe it was. Maybe it still is. Somewhere out there, beyond the pull of gravity, beyond the light of stars, something small and quiet drifts through eternity. Not gone, not lost, just free. It doesn't pulse for attention anymore. It doesn't shine for cameras or charts. It simply moves, softly, slowly, with the patience of time itself. That, perhaps, is what Atlas was meant to teach. That in the vast cold machinery of the cosmos, grace can exist. That motion can be gentle. That survival doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums. As generations passed, Atlas drifted quietly from history into myth. The people who had once recorded its light were gone, but their words remained, scattered through notes, hidden in archives, carved into the memories of those who still looked up. Even without data, the story stayed alive, not because of proof, but because of peace. Something about it made the world feel softer. Children still asked about it in planetariums. They pointed at the glowing model of the solar system and asked, "Where is it now?" The guides would smile and answer gently, "Still moving, we think." That answer never changed. It didn't need to. In the decades that followed, the name Atlas appeared in places far from science. Ships were named after it. Music borrowed its pulse. Writers used it to describe the feeling of being small yet steady. Even meditation apps used its hum, the old signal, stretched and softened, as a sound for calm. Everywhere it went, it carried the same message: move quietly, endure lightly, shine without needing to be seen. By the time the next century dawned, humanity had reached far beyond Mars. Satellites orbited distant moons. Explorers floated through blackness that once seemed unreachable. And somewhere, in the background of all their transmissions, faint patterns would sometimes appear. A sequence of 6. Always 6. Most dismissed it as interference. A few smiled, remembering. They didn't argue anymore. They just listened. Aboard one deep space vessel, a pilot found the original Atlas recording in the ship's archives. She played it one night while drifting between stars. The hum filled the cabin, low and rhythmic, the same calm heartbeat from centuries before. It echoed softly through the metal walls, blending with the vibration of the engines. For a moment, she imagined it wasn't noise at all, that maybe space itself was breathing with her, that she wasn't alone out here, that something ancient still moved with her, guiding, watching, whispering. She closed her eyes and said softly, "We made it farther than you, Atlas, but you were the one who showed us how to begin." In the archives on Earth, the last official document about Atlas had long since yellowed with time. The words were faint but clear. Observation complete. Object remains stable, no further data expected. But the universe doesn't write endings that way. Some things don't finish, they simply change form. And so Atlas did what it had always done. Moved quietly, rhythmically, endlessly forward. Its orbit no longer belonged to one star. It drifted between systems, crossing invisible borders that light itself took centuries to travel. And in that motion, it carried a rhythm the cosmos seemed to recognize. The background hum of space, what scientists once called static, began to pulse faintly in harmony, too subtle to measure, too vast to explain, but unmistakably familiar. Even now the rhythm continues, through the silence of the void, through the breath of stars, through every place where movement exists. Atlas is there, not as a comet, not as a machine, not as a question, as a memory of balance, a reminder that the universe can move with patience. And maybe that's why, when you stand beneath the night sky and listen long enough, it doesn't feel silent, it feels alive. Because somewhere, hidden beneath all the distance, something still hums in 6 gentle beats. Atlas, still moving, still teaching, still reminding us that even across eternity, there is rhythm. Night fell gently across the observatories of Earth. Domes stood quiet under the stars, their great mirrors folded inward like sleeping eyes. The world had moved on, but above it all, the sky still whispered the same quiet song. Somewhere in that endless dark, Atlas drifted on. No trails, no glow, no visible proof of its journey. Only the certainty that it was still there, moving the way it always had. Steady, silent, certain. No one tracked it anymore. No one needed to. Atlas had become part of the rhythm of the universe, as natural as sunrise and tide, as soft as the breath before sleep. On one calm night, a radio astronomer sat alone in her lab, reviewing background noise. She wasn't searching for anything, just listening, like the ones before her. The screen showed static, then faint order. 6 soft peaks. Always 6, she smiled. The pattern was too precise to be chance, too gentle to be noise. She didn't call anyone. She didn't log it as discovery. She simply turned off the lights and let the sound play through the speakers. The hum filled the room like warmth. Slow, peaceful, alive. For a moment, she closed her eyes and whispered, "You're still out there." The sound didn't answer. It didn't need to. In that quiet moment, she understood what everyone before her had learned, that Atlas had never really left. It had never been about where it went or what it was made of. It had been about the space it left behind, the stillness it gave to those who chose to listen. Because not all discoveries are loud. Some arrive like breathing. Some speak only when you stop trying to hear. As the centuries passed, humanity continued to travel. They crossed moons, built habitats on distant worlds, and sent signals farther than any light could reach. And through all of it, they carried the lesson of the silent traveler. Every mission began the same way now, with a recording. The old hum of Atlas played quietly over the speakers as the engines warmed. No words, just rhythm. A reminder to move with patience. Travel softly, they would say, like Atlas. In the far future, when humans had gone farther than the sun could touch, one ship, older than most, drifted through a quiet sector of the galaxy. Its crew had been asleep for decades, suspended in silence. Only the onboard sensors remained awake, listening as they always had. Then, somewhere outside the ship's thin metal walls, the receivers caught a faint echo. Not a voice, not a signal, just 6 gentle pulses of light. Slow, even, peaceful. The ship's systems stored it without alert, labeling it as background resonance. But if anyone had been awake, they would have known. Atlas had passed by again, still graceful, still kind. And so, the story ends the way it began, with light moving through silence. An object that came from nowhere touched the sun and left the smallest trace of calm in its wake. It never asked to be found. It never demanded to be understood. It simply existed, perfectly balanced between motion and rest. That was its message. That was its gift, a reminder that not all journeys burn bright. Some just continue quietly, trusting that being is enough. If you listen to the night, really listen, you might still feel it, a faint rhythm beneath the noise of wind, beneath the hum of the world. 6 beats, steady, patient, eternal, Atlas. The traveler who taught the universe how to move softly. And as long as there are ears willing to listen, it will never be gone.